When we grow up, we are told to stop believing in monsters and ghosts. These stories are just kid stuff. Growing up means becoming serious, rational, and realistic, dismissing these fears as silly imaginings. Horror movies suspend this way of being the serious, realistic adult. I do not mean that horror brings us back to a more childish state where we still believed in magic, but precisely the opposite. Horror confronts us with the monsters and ghosts that are very real in our individual and collective psyches. Like no other genre, it gives shape to what occurs underneath the skin, to our collective traumas and fears. It is not childish escapism that takes you away from reality, but a reappropriation of the language of children who know and intuit very well what is happening around them. Horror revisits this language without the gaslighting of parental authority figures who tell you what is true and what is not, what matters and what does not, whose feelings and experiences matter and whose do not. With its own magic, horror reveals the magic trick of the serious adult, the adult who once told us to grow up with the same seriousness. The serious adult turns the vice of ignoring and repressing the obvious into a virtue by shaming the child. The message of growing up is often a way of saying, stop being so sensitive to what is going on around you, and learn to ignore what you know to be important. It is emotional blackmail. If you want love and recognition from us, the parents, the adults, society, then shut up. Put a lid on it. This is the violence of an authoritarian relationship between parent and child, sanctioned with names of responsibility and maturity. By doing so, the adult justifies the way they have learned or been forced to repress what is underneath the surface, to ignore the messages from the body, the mind, and the people around you that point out that something is terribly wrong. Jennifer Kent's feature film debut, The Babadook from 2014, is one of those horror movies that show the cost of ignoring the very real monsters in our individual and collective lives. It is usually interpreted as an exploration of the costs of unacknowledged grief. Without acknowledging its existence, it grows and becomes monstrous, consuming yourself and your loved ones. Amelia, who lost her husband in a car accident as he was driving her to the hospital to give birth, struggles with her son's erratic behavior and fear of a monster he claims is haunting them. The monster, who first makes his appearance through a children's book called The Babadook, continues to reappear in the lives of Amelia and Samuel. Amelia spirals into paranoia, becoming violent and unrecognizable, while Samuel fights to protect them both. Ultimately, Amelia confronts her repressed grief and rage, gaining the strength to subdue the Babadook, which she traps in the basement. She manages to finally confront the grief and trauma. By doing so, it no longer has the power over her, and she is able to give us space for it. The film ends with the monster still present, symbolizing how trauma can never be eradicated, but must be given a space in one's life. By learning to face loss, learning to live with the monster instead of repressing it, one can learn to live and love again. At the same time, it is a feminist exploration of motherhood, both psychologically and sociologically. How do these threads of grief and motherhood relate, and why are mothers so often associated with monsters? Using Adrienne Rich's key distinction between motherhood as heteropatriarchal institution and mothering as experience, I will discuss The Babadook as interrogating the politics of the family, the impossible demands on mothers, and the stigmatization of the single mother. Based on this distinction between institution and experience, this feminist reading suggests that Amelia's incapacity to acknowledge her grief is because of her attempt at living up to the impossible demands of being the perfect mother. The perfect mother does not show negative emotions, experiences no emotional ambivalence towards her children, and must sacrifice herself to the happy life and future of her children. Coming to terms with grief is also a letting go of the internalized imperatives of motherhood. Once she sheds the image of the perfect mother and the perfect family, she is able to enter into a different type of relationship, opening up for a potentially liberating experience as mother. I will look at the traditional symbolism of motherhood and the family, and the societal judgment and pathologization of the single mother. At first, the Babadook seems to lean into the conservative patriarchal reading that suggests that the mother without a man to keep her in check becomes monstrous and pathological, devouring her own children, and that therefore the nuclear family with its paternal authority must be restored for order and normalcy to rule. By introducing Jordan Peterson as today's villain, the high priest of misogyny and the nuclear family, I will first go along with this conservative interpretation, showing why women, especially mothers and children, are associated with monsters. Then I show how Jennifer Kent plays with this symbolism and subverts it, criticizing the patriarchal family politics and opening it up to a different kind of experience of mothering that ceases to be defined by the impossible cultural image of the perfect mother that one is supposed to live up to. As with many horror movies, the family home becomes a space of terror. The home is supposed to be the safest, most intimate and familiar place, a safe haven of love and care that's a protective layer from the hardships of the outside world. In classic American horror films, the threat to the private home comes from the outside. The external threat of the stranger danger reinforces the patriarchal divide between public and private spaces. This trope frames the outside world as a source of danger that breaches the sanctuary of the home, confirming that the safety of the home must be protected from the stranger danger, sanctioning the belief that the free individual and the police must protect the private family and private property. In the Babadook, the threat does not come from outside, but from within.
I'll make sure nothing gets in tonight. All right, Samuel? Nothing is coming in here tonight.
The supposed peace, love, and safety of the domestic home is in fact what carries the greatest danger. In this confined domestic space, Jennifer Kent can explore all the psychological terror that accompanies the patriarchal division of the public and the private.
I told you not to call anyone and you deliberately disobeyed me. Is this the only way I can trust you not to embarrass me in front of our neighbors?
Amelia's investment in the image of the perfect mother and the perfect family is clear in her relation to her neighbor, Mrs. Roach. Although she dutifully helps her, Amelia does not trust her neighbor. She remains an outsider for whom one must keep up the appearances that everything behind the doors of the private home is just fine, a space of family happiness. Despite the care and concern of the neighbor, the door to the private home should never be opened to strangers. Samuel and Mrs. Roach do not play by the rules of keeping up the appearances. Here there are no taboos. Mrs. Roach's Parkinson or Samuel's dead father are not secrets or blemishes, but accepted as the facts that they are. Amelia scolds Samuel for speaking what is on his mind. Samuel's unfiltered observations have to be disciplined so that he can play the part of the respectable son in a respectable family. Once Amelia gives up the image of being the perfect mother in control of a normal household, she no longer has to police Samuel for freely speaking about the neighbor's Parkinson. The neighbor ceases to be an outsider for whom one must keep up the appearances, and becomes someone to trust in the shared social space of mutual care. Feminists have long pointed out that the division between the public and the private is a patriarchal arrangement to socially isolate women and children. By isolating women from each other, it prevents a potential shared space of power that can create mutual support and accountability towards the community. In many societies, this distinction between the public and the private does not operate in the same way. The home and motherhood does not necessarily have to mean the subjection to such a patriarchal arrangement and the prevention of social systems of support. But the patriarchal nuclear family operates through this distinction between the public and the private. It diminishes the social power of women and makes women and children more vulnerable to domestic abuse. By separating the political from the private realm, any abuse inside the house is rendered as a non-political issue, a private affair. From the perspective of the institution of motherhood, responsible in isolation for the well-being of the children, the social support and mutual aid that is needed for child rearing and survival becomes a sign of having failed as a mother. Asking for help would mean failing your duties as a mother, a source of shame. Breaking down these barriers between the private and the public allows for the mutual aid and care in the social sphere and counters the depoliticization of so-called private affairs. The scenes of the White Mother and Son conjure the familiar cultural images of a mother, of a family home. But something is off. The picture of the perfect nuclear family is incomplete. The father is missing. Although conservatives present the nuclear family as traditional and eternal, the nuclear family is in fact a modern invention, inseparable from a new class politics and racial politics with the rise of capitalism and colonialism, and solidified in the Victorian times of empire. In this ideology and institution of motherhood, the image of the perfectly caring, tender, morally pure mother emerged. This maternal ideal of womanhood is always in relation to the other patriarchal archetypes of womanhood, as promiscuous, wild, sexual, primitive, aggressive. The ideology and institution of motherhood always contains an impossible imperative of becoming the perfect mother and steer away from the imminent threat of slipping into its dangerous other. Let's listen to today's villain, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who never ceases to pathologize women, mothers in general, and especially single mothers, and preach the gospel of the nuclear family, in which the father ensures discipline, rationality, and order, preventing the excesses of maternal chaos.
Here's the insight. Okay, so human infants are born in an incredibly underdeveloped state. Now, the cost that we pay for that is the unbelievable vulnerability of human infants. Okay, now the cost the mothers pay for that is that the neonate is so dependent that they need 100% care. Okay, so that means that the impetus of agreeableness, that personality trait, in combination with negative emotion, that's the two feminine personality traits, high negative emotion and high agreeableness. The purest expression of that is give the suffering infant what it needs right now, no matter what. Right, okay, and that's perfectly legitimate for 6 months.
For an infant.
Well, for 6 months. For 6 months,
Yeah.
It's the right attitude. Now, okay, and it's a very, very powerful instinct. It's the maternal instinct upon which the human species depends. Okay, the question is what happens when that pathologizes? Okay, so what does it look like when it pathologizes? Well, the first is you treat a 1-year-old like a 6-month-old. Or you treat a 5-year-old like a 6-month-old. You just give in to whatever they want right now. Well, that means that you start to interfere with their development. That's where the devouring mother comes in. Right, okay, and that's very, very bad. That's how you make useless, entitled, narcissistic, privileged, dependent, and terrified children, right? Who also hate their parents, right? So that's a very bad idea. Okay, but here's something even worse than that, which no one will talk about and which no one will contend with. Okay, that maternal instinct is hyper powerful, and it's the defining characteristic of femininity. The question that our culture is facing now is, what happens when women enter into the political arena and that instinct doesn't find its proper place? And the answer is, as far as I can tell, is that childless women infantilize everything.
Yep.
Yeah, well, God, Michael,
Boy.
If that's true, we are in serious trouble. Like, you know, because we know the most woke disciplines, for example, in the universities are the ones with the highest percentage of women. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming women, and because I think men have abdicated the responsibility on that front as well. And I'm also not unhappy that we've been able to determine how to capitalize on the broad intellectual abilities of women in the broader civilizational scheme of things, let's say. That's not my point. My point is that we don't know what sort of political psychopathologies will be specific to females, and we bloody well know now. And part of that's that infantilization of everything. And then there's another associated issue, which is women are also very good, let's say, at spotting predators. Okay, if you have an infant and you misidentify a predator, you know, you call something a predator that isn't, whatever, you protect your baby, It's not a problem. It's kind of hard on the misidentified predator.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so part of that cluster B proclivity of the psychopathological woman to cry wolf continually and profit thereby is also a manifestation of that maternal instinct. It's right. You oppose me, you must be a predator. And if you're, this is the terrible thing about the devouring mother pathology is, if you're a predator, no punishment is too harsh for you, right? No quarter. Right, why would you give quarters to something that wants to eat your child, right? It's like, no quarter. And so that's another problem that we have no idea what to do.
In short, a mother is either too much mother, thereby spoiling the child, or too little mother, women staying away from their purpose and essence. Women should be mothers, but this role is inherently prone to excess and chaos. Therefore, women should be mothers held in check in rational organization of the nuclear family, where the father as the head of the family maintains the order and prevents the excesses of womanhood and maternity. Women's essence is nurturing infants, and as soon as they do anything else, things become pathological and monstrous. Women are essentially mothers, and mothers should be kept in check by fathers. Otherwise, both mother and child will become monstrous. The single mother is therefore a pathology, a sickness, a threat, and if there is no father to keep her in check, the state will have to step in to control this menace of society. The preachers of the nuclear family gospel will of course hold up the images of the beautiful, harmonious, complementary nature of marriage based on mutual respect and support, but underneath there is the old message of domination and male supremacy. Women should be mothers, kept in check by order and rationality that can only be ensured by the presence of a strong man who you must submit to. Freud's description of the family and the Oedipus complex is based on this ideal of the Victorian family. The child is first a libidinal creature without any reason, driven by the pleasure principle embodied by the mother.
Oh, don't do that!
The close tie between mother and child represents an initial primitive stage only driven by pleasure. The father represents the reality principle, the principle of rationality and order. The father must discipline the child, and through this discipline the child moves away from the irrationality and selfishness of the pleasure principle and learns to separate reality from fantasy. Jordan Peterson rehashes these theories with his archetypes of the masculine order versus the feminine chaos, which directly inform his ideas of women, mothers, men, fathers, and the family. But in this symbolism, there is a tension between nature, as a feminine space of chaos, and civilization, the masculine space of order and reason. The discourse on nature is always ambivalent. On the one hand, it signifies what is eternal, unchangeable, fixed, and desirable. On the other hand, it is that which is out of control of rationality and threatens the social order. It must be conquered and dominated in order for an order and morality to reign. Women and children are considered closer to nature than men and are therefore in need of being subjected to masculine reason. Nature without rational control becomes monstrous. Peterson does not only speak about the threat of pathological mothers, but also treats children as little monsters that need to be disciplined. The idea is that children are naturally violent and selfish, and only by subjecting them to the father's authority will children grow up into morally responsible social beings. In the Babadook, Samuel is depicted as a typical aggressive and problematic child who destroys things and hurts others. From the conservative reading, this would indicate the missing father, leading child and mother to turn into perverse pathological beings, letting out the natural evil and selfishness which would become a threat to society. But it's clear that Samuel's aggression is not because of some innate nature, but as a response to the predicament he is in. Completely dependent on his mother, he seeks her love and approval while the depression and unspoken terror fill the space. It is his way of navigating the drama of being dependent on the love and care of a single person who secretly resents him. To acknowledge that the person he loves the most and is completely dependent on actually hates him is too painful. He senses that there is something standing in between his mother and him, something that prevents them from fully loving and caring for each other. This is the monster, and he will prove himself worthy of the love of his mother by attacking the monster and protecting her from it. But the monster is too strong for his weapons and magic. He can only destroy it with his raw love. Samuel's violence is not only an attempt at playing the heroic boy to save the mother, it is also self-defense. Even though he is begging for his mother's love, he does not take abuse. Even in a state of complete dependency and powerlessness, because of the social organization in isolated families and the erosion of community, people intuitively stand up against abuse and exploitation. The love that he craves so much and needs for his survival does not mean giving up his dignity and self-respect. This is necessary for the authentic love to flow between them. Attacking the monster also means attacking a part of the mother in order to survive and maintain a sense of self, and for an authentic relationship of love with his mother to be possible. As much as Amelia tries to play the part of the perfect mother and the perfect family, she is not accepted as such. The harder she tries to fit in with the other mothers who do seem to embody the middle-class ideal of the perfect family, the more she is judged and alienated. A depressed mother and a problematic child are like a disease that the good families have to keep their distance from. Instead of expecting support from others, the pathological family without the father is to be judged and shamed. The state authority, taking the role of the absentee father, will step in to prevent the social pathology from spreading. It is significant that Amelia comes so close to the culturally acceptable image of the perfect, caring white mother. Some have criticized that the movie lacks an exploration of race by focusing on the traditional and culturally familiar image of white motherhood. But by starting from this collective iconography, the movie can exploit the descent into madness and lay bare the fragility and undesirability of this cultural image. One of the first signs of Amelia's descent into madness is in front of the television, where she is confronted with a pathological mother who killed her own child. This is the only time that there is an Aboriginal or person of color in the film. There is a long tradition of representing racialized women as pathological mothers, engulfed by irrationality, maternal excess, incapable of raising their children in a civilized way. It is often evoked as a justification for white supremacist patriarchal civilizing mission. Pathologizing racialized women and communities as detrimental to their children justifies state intervention. In Australia, the settler state deliberately destroyed many Aboriginal families by stealing their children based on a similar white supremacist ideology. This white patriarchal intervention would civilize Aboriginal children, kill the Aboriginal within to become a civilized human being.
Hundreds of half-caste children have been gathered up and brought here to be given the benefit of everything our culture has to offer. For if we are to fit and train such children for the future, they cannot be left as they are. And in spite of himself, the native must be helped.
Like the legal status of children, women and racialized people for the longest of time did not have full legal status of full personhood. The idea that they are closer to nature and therefore in need of rational governance by white men serves the ruling class under racial capitalism. The underlying material gains are twofold. It destroys and removes indigenous claims to the land by denigrating and destroying their economic, political, social, and cultural ways of life. And second, it creates a class of unskilled laborers that would serve white people. Capitalism and colonialism fit hand in glove in this double aim that becomes illegible through the ideology of the white supremacist family politic. The state has the power to police, survey, and destroy families that diverge too widely from the nuclear family form, all the forms of kinship that do not serve the national capitalist economy of production and reproduction. The white working class single mother, 2 steps away from the normal middle class nuclear family, is at danger of slipping away in the swamp of maternal madness and monstrosity, away from whiteness, away from acceptability. The picture of the perfect mother thus plays into a white supremacist family politic premised on an ideology of racialized othering and the policing of families that fall outside of the middle-class white norm.
It must be difficult. I do volunteer work with some disadvantaged women, and a few of them have lost their husbands, and they find it very hard.
How's Richard's nurture going?
In the patriarchal nuclear family, the father is the head and ruler of the family as an estate, reflecting the relationship between the state and its citizens. In the case of the missing father, the state takes over the role of the father and intervenes and disciplines the pathological family. The single mother is a figure that is always the target of state intervention, demonized and pathologized as disastrous for children and unworthy of state support. As Adrienne Rich points out, the image of the perfect mother does not tolerate any ambivalent or negative emotion. Amelia's grief is incompatible with her attempt at playing the mother. The unacknowledged grief turns into resentment towards her son, who she secretly holds responsible for the loss of her partner. The recurring nightmares show Amelia stuck in the past, unable to move forward. There are many expectations around grief. Whereas many cultures create spaces for long periods of grief and an ongoing relationship with the dead, Western modern notions of grief tend to pathologize excessive grief.
It'll be 7 years. Isn't it time you moved on?
One needs to move on and overcome the irrational desire to return to the fantasy of union that clings on to the dead beloved. To be normal means to move on. It is precisely Amelia's attempt at being normal that prevents her from facing her grief. Her desire to be normal is circumscribed by the image of the caring mother and maintaining the illusion of being a normal family. She nevertheless will always remain an outsider to these normative spaces and will never quite fit in. But she is not able to give up on the idea of being that mother, normal and perfect, having a normal and perfect child. As long as she clings on to this norm, the monster will grow and ultimately destroy her and her son. The institution of motherhood turns grief into a source of shame and a dirty secret that children must be kept safe from. But children will always intuit what is underneath the skin, since their survival depends on the ability to read the moods and expectations of the people that take care of them. The happy family without negative emotion is a societally sanctioned space of structural terror that can only be destroyed by communal support and the depathologization of mothers. We inherit a patriarchal tradition that associates the mother and the monster, the maternal and the monstrous. Jennifer Kent's The Babadook appropriates this symbolic language to tell a feminist tale that moves away from the patriarchal ideology and institution of motherhood, its impossible demands, and the repression of emotional ambivalence it induces, the promises of happiness and the good life it promotes, and tells a story of an experience of motherhood outside of the patriarchal plot. If we were to follow the conservative reading, based on the idea that a mother without a father leads to monstrosity, we might expect the movie to end with a new romance, which would indicate that she has learned to move on from the excessive and pathological grief of her previous beloved, and that she can now create the perfect happy nuclear family that Samuel needs. But there is no return to the restoration of the perfect family by introducing a new love interest. There's a societal expectation that one leaves behind the past, overcomes one's grief, in order to enter into the present as a fully mature and rational person who does not irrationally cling on to the past, and to focus on the happy future of the family and the child. Her grief is not something to overcome and place in the past, but it is something that needs to be confronted and continuously lived with. She literally learns to give grief a space in her life, giving up on the societal and psychological injunction to leave it behind in the past. The grief does not go away, the monster does not go away, one must learn to live with the monster. Acknowledging the monster, she can let go of the toxic norms and expectations of motherhood. By giving up on the institution and ideology of motherhood, a different experience of mothering becomes possible. If the monster is that which troubles and can never be assimilated to the norm, normative motherhood, normal grief, normal childhood, normal families, then we all contain monsters. If we strive to be normal, the perfect mother, the perfect child, the perfect family, then the monster will consume us and terror will reign. If we accept and acknowledge the monster and learn to identify and let go of the toxic norms and expectations of who we think we are supposed to be, then the monster ceases to be a threat to who we are. Nourishing and maintaining a relationship with the monster, we can fully embrace ourselves as the broken people that we are, far from normal and ideal, but capable of love and meaningful connection.